Okay, hello everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here for today's webinar. We're really excited about it. Let's talk common sense. Welcome. This session will be recorded. Over the next 70, we'll be talking about common sense, the commons, climate change, and their relation to this political moment. My name is Barbara Leckie, and I'm Academic Director at Re.Climate and the moderator for this webinar. I'm also a professor in the English department at the Institute of the Comparative Study, professor in the English department and the Institute for the Comparative Study of Literature, Art, and Culture at Carleton University. We have people attending today from all across Canada and the United States, what we also call Turtle Island, and from many other places as well. While we wait for others to join, I invite you to take a moment to introduce yourself and acknowledge where you call home. And if you feel inclined to try to locate us in place, also note the weather where you are. And I'll tell you that where I am, it's snowing this really beautiful snow. I'm in Ottawa. We have more than 500 people registered for today's webinar, so we're really happy to see so many people out for this. The webinar itself is hosted by Re.Climate, Canada's Centre for Climate Communication and Engagement at Carleton University. We offer resources, training, strategy, and research on climate communication and engagement. And again, I'll encourage anyone who's arriving now to just introduce yourself in the chat. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We're grateful for their stewardship of this land. Carolyn Lesjak, featured on the podcast we'll be discussing today, describes the commons as a concept that has its feet on the ground. We all have our feet on the ground. We're all attached to the land in one way or another. And as we begin a webinar that addresses the commons as one of its topics, I'm acutely aware of the limitations of words. And especially words in brief land acknowledgements like this. But I also think words are actions. And in these moments when we are increasingly unable to say climate change in certain forums, including in an event I was recently involved with, I'm reminded again of how much the actions that words are matter. I'm excited to be here today with you to introduce our new podcast, Common Sense. We're lucky to have two of the wonderful guests featured on the podcast, Astra Taylor and Candis Callison, and my co-creator and co-host, Joel Westheimer. I also want to give a shout out to our amazing producer, Mary Stinson, and technical producer, Rihanna Phillip, and to the many wonderful RAs who helped us along the way, and they're listed on the website. Before I introduce the speakers, though, I want to ask Niv from the Re.Climate team to play the trailer of the podcast for us. Thanks, Niv.
On January 7th, 2025, a series of devastating wildfires began in the Santa Monica Mountains, quickly sweeping through huge swaths of Los Angeles, burning countless homes and killing 29 people. By the time the fires were contained, more than 40,000 acres had been destroyed.
There's not a single house left standing.
Tough day today.
What happened in Los Angeles was violent and it was devastating. It was the latest in a growing number of catastrophic weather events that have caused immense destruction and upended lives. This is unlikely to change anytime soon. And in fact, it will almost certainly get much worse.
I'm Joel Westheimer.
And I'm Barbara Leckie.
And this is Common Sense, produced by Mary Stinson, a series where we ask how common sense relates to the climate crisis.
Today, as fires ravage forests and cities, sea levels continue to rise, and cyclones destroy infrastructure, many politicians insist that a market economy, competition, and individual actions will solve our problems. It's just common sense.
Common sense often signals that there's really only one way to look at things, that any other path is misguided. Common sense works best when it's not questioned. In this podcast, we decided to question it.
I would define common sense as something we're in a fight over.
I think of common sense as the given and the very thing that needs to be upended and unsettled.
Common sense is the most political of all categories.
Common sense, like a lot of terms, is what philosophers call essentially contested.
I see common sense as something that is actually in motion.
I can see the common sense changing very quickly.
Common sense. So interesting to think about because it's like a third rail, right?
Why at this moment are there references to common sense everywhere we look? Can we reclaim common sense for a livable future? We think we can. We're going to take a leap here and say that an idea with a long history can help us see things differently. Now let me explain. We're talking about the idea of the commons, the physical, natural, and cultural resources we all share. The land, water, and air, public education and public transit, shared conversations, and collective action.
Commons, for me, is a European concept.
So when we're talking about the commons, we are talking about something that is rooted in a mode of collective land ownership, and that we shouldn't idealize necessarily.
The word commons is a little bit fraught, but I think it's productive to stay with it.
It's a kind of language that can be taken up, that has its feet on the ground.
The commons gives us a way to think otherwise.
Yup, you guessed it. That's why this podcast is called Commons Sense. Commons with an S.
In this season, we'll talk with Candis Callison, Bill McGibbon, Astra Taylor, and many others.
Join us to think together and ask the questions that those in power don't want us to ask. Support for Common Sense comes from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Shared Online Projects Initiative at Carleton University and the University of Ottawa, and from Re.Climate, Canada's National Centre for Climate Communications and Engagement. Special thanks to Rihanna Phillip for the technical production of this podcast.
Thank you so much, Niv. So now I will introduce our panelists. Astra Taylor is a writer, filmmaker, and organizer. She is the director of numerous documentaries, and her books include, and as I read the titles, you'll hear how apt they are, each one for this moment. Books and titles that include The Age of Insecurity, Coming Together as Things Fall Apart. Democracy may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. And the American Book Award winner, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. Her most recent book is Solidarity, The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, co-written with Leah Hunt Hendricks. Astra gave the 2023 Massey Lecture, and she co-founded the Debt Collective, a union of debtors. My conversation with Astra for the podcast took place a few days after the American election in November. And she had been and continues to work tirelessly to build networks and confront this moment by putting people at the center of her work. In our podcast, she offers inspiring examples how common sense changes can change. Indeed, how the collaborative work she's done has contributed to one change in relation to debt, and how the idea of the commons offers one example of what that change could look like. Candis Callison is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Journalism, Media, and Public Discourse at the University of British Columbia. She is the author of How Climate Change Comes to Matter, The Communal Life of Facts, and the co-author of Reckoning, Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. She is currently working on a long-term research project about the journalism and media in Arctic and Northern regions. She is a member of the Tahltan Nation and a regular contributor to the podcast Media Indigena, and we'll learn more about that in a moment. I remember how transformative I found How Climate Change Comes to Matter when I read it. Like Astra, Candis is beautifully attuned to the ideas of collective sense-making. We might all be talking about climate change, but our different communities do not all talk about it in the same way. In our podcast, she describes how, for people to care about climate, Communities have to, in her words, come alongside with their own language, their own way of making sense of the world. Joel Westheimer is a professor of democracy and education at the University of Ottawa and an education columnist for CBC Radio, and importantly to me, the co-creator of the podcast. His books include Among School Teachers, Autonomy and Ideology in Teachers' Work, Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in American Schools, and his most recent book, What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good. He is a regular contributor to newspapers and magazines, including the Washington Post and the Globe and Mail. In our conversation today, he'll tackle the role of climate and public education in relation to the commons. This webinar, all of us here today, is at the heart of what our podcast is about, a forum for shared conversation and thinking together to create, as Imre Zeman, another person we feature on the podcast, notes, quote, the conditions for imagining alternatives to what counts as climate sense, as common sense. I often think of common sense and climate sense as linked. And so there you go. At the end of our webinar, we'll have time for a Q&A session. Until then, we really encourage you to use the chat on the side. But if you are posing questions for the Q&A, you can pose them with that feature at the bottom of the page. I also wanted to let you know that due to a teaching conflict, Candis will have to leave a little early, but she'll be happy to answer your questions if you put them in the chat or the Q&A, or send them to us at Re.Climate. Okay, I mentioned the Q&A at the bottom, the chat function. I think we're good. All right, so we're going to jump into the first question, which I'm going to ask of all the panelists. And that is, how do you think about common sense in general? If you want to, so it's a very broad question. If you want to add any thoughts about how the phrase common sense sort of resonates for you in this current political moment, definitely feel free, but I'm going to keep it general as well. But I also want to invite everyone who's attending today, if you feel inclined, to answer the question yourself in the chat. Like, what does common sense bring up for you? What are you thinking about common sense today? So for this question, I will start with Candis.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here with all of you and to talk to you from Musqueam land. I'm at UBC in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. That's why you have this beautiful turtle behind me. I was actually thinking about how incredible it is to see all of the land acknowledgements in the chat. Because 20 years ago, those of us who are in the older age category know that this was not something that most people would consider to be, let's say, common sense, right? So I tend to think about common sense in a bunch of different ways, because as a former journalist who was trained in cultural anthropology and as an Indigenous person, there's no doubt in my mind that common sense is about place and time and culture. It's how societies generally tend to speak about what they hold in common. But in a society that has a long colonial history, common sense has been used in a lot of very damaging ways. There's a great history book written by Mark Anderson and Carmen Robertson called Seeing Red, where they really address this. They look at journalism in Canada's newspapers from pre-Confederation through to the present and see how common sense has been used as a whistle call in some ways, right? To demarcate who's in and outside of society. And so I really think very carefully before I ever use it as a term in a sentence, because it has been used so powerfully, in many different forms, right? In politics, in journalism, in scholarship to a certain extent as well. And so I think we have to be really careful about how we use it. And I love it that you guys have put an S on the end of commons.
Thank you so much, Candis. Those are really important points, and something I think we want to be cautious about how the words circulate and where they circulate and who's speaking them. Astra, I'll turn to you now for that.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here with you all. And thanks for kicking us off with that great reflection, Candis. I'm in Brooklyn, New York right now on Lenape land. And I just want to underscore I just, as the organizer in me is always wanting to remind people, common sense is something that we can change. And we have that even inherent in the phrase making sense, right? We say, I'm trying to make sense of something, right? Which says it's something we made, it's something we make, we do together. At the same time, there's the sort of colloquial use of common sense. I'm using it in the singular here of like, someone has common sense, they're not an idiot. And I'm honestly feeling a bit of that is lacking. Today, I woke up to the news that maybe there will not be another iteration of the flu vaccine. That is one of the great public health, international collaborative, forms of keeping people safe and healthy. And I thought, it's not common sense that we should have the flu vaccine. So I'm having some, I think, what I thought was common sense is shifting a little bit right now, or quite a bit. So as we investigate the term and deconstruct it, I also just want to kind of name it in its most kind of conventional sense and say, wow, where is that? Things are different than I thought. I also, I was obviously on your podcast, got to think about this a little bit. We talked a lot about the common and the common side. And as we were sitting here together, I was thinking about the sense side, that sensing is, it's physical, it's a faculty, right? Our senses, our body, the information we take in the natural world. And I think there's a way that we're actually being instructed not to trust our senses. And there's something in the common sense. And I say that because I spend a lot of time in North Carolina, where the hurricane did immense damage. And it's overwhelming to the senses to see, still to this day, cars, semi-trucks, trains, devastation, fast food joints that look like they've been through the apocalypse, right? So, very much what people are seeing in California, what people saw in parts of Canada. And yet we're being told, don't trust your senses. This isn't climate change. This isn't, the disaster that it actually is. And so I just want to think about that embodied bit of what common sense is, and how, there are these, things that are in front of our eyes in some cases and becoming more so, and yet the narrative contradicts them. So that's what came to my mind as we were hanging out.
Yeah, that's great. There's a great historian of common sense, Sophia Rosenfeld, and she starts the book with "Hot things can burn you," and then 2 + 2 = 4 as examples of, I think, that conventional common sense you're referring to, and then describes how, like, part of the interesting thing about common sense is how you toggle between two domains, both as really obvious things and also all the underlying norms and values that we don't articulate. But when you were mentioning weather, and I was thinking of hot things can burn you, it really is that moment where weather is changing, and what we used to think would be one thing is now another, and then you sort of adjust.
And we're being told 2 + 2 = 5.
Exactly, we're being told 2 +, and we're being told it didn't rain on certain days, and there's all sorts of things that are happening that make you have to adjust how you think about sense. But I also, one last thing, the comment on sense is really nice for the ways in which we're trying to link it to the commons, which is also kind of, well, it's material, it starts with the materiality of land, but then we think of it more expansively. All right, Joel.
Well, first of all, I think it's common sense that people joined this webinar, right? So that's we'll start there. But I mean that partly seriously, is that sometimes when we employ common sense, it sort of makes sense to almost everyone, and we can all agree on it. So it's common sense not to touch a hot stove, right? But even when we agree, I think that it's never neutral, right? It's deployed, and I use the term deployed as a military metaphor deliberately. It's deployed as the kind of air we breathe, right? The just what's around us. Margaret Mead said that if human beings were fish, the last thing they would discover would be water, right? Because it's all around us, and so we don't see it. And so it implies that there's no other perspectives. It just is. And that, of course, as Candis and Astra said, just isn't true, right? It's always ideological. It's always constructed. And it's not true in the present. I mean, witness the plane crash in DC, right? Trump says, well, the reason the planes crashed is because of DEI, which gives you a sense of how radically wacky it can be and still be called common sense. Because when a reporter asked him how he concluded that the plane crashed because of DEI, he said, well, it's just common sense, right? And and so we can also note that it changes so fast, right? He can radically shift what we think of as common sense, because that would have just been thought of as ludicrous just a short time ago. But again, as Astra said, I mean, we can change it too, right? It gives us the power to change it also. And besides being not true in the present, it's not, well, first of all, it wasn't true in the past. I mean, I'll just give the example of Katrina, since I work in education. Hurricane Katrina gave this common sense opportunity to remake the public education system there, because Katrina destroyed most of the public schools. But the common sense of how to remake them was to make them all private charter schools. And that has basically decimated education in New Orleans. And it's true that it was an opportunity to remake the public schools, to remake them in ways that were much better, but it turned out to make them much worse, except to the benefit of many wealthy people who wanted that sort of neoliberal agenda to take over. And besides being not true in the present or the past, it's not true over time, right? What's common sense changes over time. The earth is flat. Blacks are not as smart as white people. I would like to have thought that was, dead forever. But of course, remarkably, plutocrats have reanimated that position. And in that sense, it's often weaponized. No matter how radical and how wacky it is, it can be weaponized to further one agenda at the expense of another. And so we always need to ask, whose common sense is it? To whose benefit is it, and who suffers? And I do think that we also can use that power of common sense to reshape the conversation in an agenda that we can all agree with. We on this webinar, I mean.
Thank you, Joel. Well, we'll move into a little bit more on common sense now with the next couple of questions. And the first one is to you, Astra. In your book, you've called our age the age of insecurity. How do security and insecurity, in your view, relate to common sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So maybe I'll just say, part of what I wanted to do by talking about insecurity was challenge a bit of what had become common sense on the left, or broadly in the progressive movement, which was that, the most important thing to do is to talk about inequality, which I am certainly very fond of talking about. I think it's incredibly important and egregious that a handful of people control most of the wealth in this world. And I think we are seeing today that we were not being hysterical when we said that billionaires are a threat to democracy, to the planet, and that it might be a good idea to abolish them by dispossessing them of their wealth. Of course, I just mean non-violently, seizing what they have gotten through objectionable means. So, inequality is important, but what I wanted to do is to say we have to add a different dimension, which is the dimension of actually the senses, of feeling, of embodiment, of, I like to say that economic issues are always emotional ones, that you can never just talk about your finances without also talking about your feelings. And so the dimension of insecurity for me was actually kind of speaking to a latent common sense, the fact that we all kind of know that, we all worry when we think about how are we going to pay the bills 6 months, a year from now, maybe 30 years from now. Am I going to be able to retire with some semblance of dignity? Am I going to be able to keep my family housed? Am I going to be able to have a dignified life? And so I wanted to kind of bring that into the conversation. So I often describe inequality as sort of charts, dots on a chart, right? The distribution of income or wealth, whereas insecurity speaks to how those dots feel. You might have enough today, but you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We're beings in time, and so insecurity kind of provides a way of thinking about that. And I think, you know, the flip side of that is, okay, so then what is security? And in current economic conditions, we are told that security is a private enterprise. Well, go fill up that retirement account, buy that property, you know, go to the gym, you know, Botox your face or whatever, so you won't get fired. You won't be seen as old and disposable. And, or, you know, worse, buy some weapons, you know, go get a bunker so you can survive climate catastrophe, right? Move to higher ground. Very defensive, individualistic, competitive view of security. And I make the case in the book that actually the only kind of security I think that's worth fighting for is collaborative and rooted in a revitalized idea of the commons, right? That we actually only find security by creating solidarity and by meeting our needs collectively. So through a socially productive, future-oriented enterprise.
Yeah, I love how you talk about it as translating insecurity into solidarity. It's such a good point. Thank you. So Candis, I'm going to turn now to public media and journalism and the ways in which they relate to sense making. If you want to talk about social media as well, great. But just reflecting on public media, journalism, maybe social media in the context of sense making, with that idea of like we make common sense too.
Yeah, journalists have often been thought of as sense makers, right? You arrive at the scene of a crime, an event, etc., and your job is to make sense of what has happened, as well as to record the events that you witness. You know, I taught at a journalism school for a number of years, well over a decade, and that was absolutely a part of how I approach teaching ethics, for example, is what's the ethical framework? We need to think about how to make sense of what's going on here, whose knowledge matters, whose voice matters. How do we think about what experts to call on? And, you know, journalism has been thought of historically in a few different ways. One of the most important, right, is as a fourth estate, as, you know, something that can hold power to account, that keeps a watchdog, you know, view of different institutions and corporations, you know, all of the things that we take for granted as part of our commons, right? Part of what we consider to be public. And at the same time, journalism is also part of culture, right? And that's the sense-making part of it, actually, is the cultural part of it, right? James Carey is a well-known journalism scholar, now passed away, but he talked about, you know, back in the 80s, he talked about how journalists size up an event, right? They actually name enemies and allies. So that's part of the function of journalism, is to help us know how to think about an event, right? How to make sense of it. That's part of the sense-making role. And so, you know, all the ways that we thought about journalism have kind of been up for grabs in the last 20 years, right? As digital media has produced these new platforms, these new sense makers, right? And now, I mean, we're talking today, the day after Jeff Bezos has announced that the opinion page at the Washington Post shall now be devoted to personal liberty and free market, right? So as a, you know, and opinion pages, let's face it, right, have often been a space where common sense has been trotted out by both the left and the right and the center. Like everybody kind of uses that as a way to mobilize common sense. So, you know, and we also have platforms like Twitter that have been turned into X that, you know, we had thought of. I think, you know, those of us who were online early in the mid to late 2000s, we were thinking about them very much as public utilities, as commons spaces. And now it's become very clear that they are private corporations, right, that make their own decisions about how and when we can speak, about what the algorithm tells us is the top thing that people are speaking about. So that, over determination of what our common spaces are, of who gets to make sense, right? All of that is very much in motion, right? And I think Astra's point that we can change things. Previously, I think we saw social media as a vehicle for change, and it has done great things, holding journalists and news organizations accountable. But we're in a different moment where it's not clear where the commons are. It's not clear how to move the public. It's not clear, where information and, good evidence stories can always be found. There's a run to security of traditional media, but is that really the path we want to go forward? Don't we also want to preserve spaces where a lot of diverse voices can speak and be heard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And finding those spaces, building those spaces, creating the conditions for them to thrive seems like one of the challenges of this time. Okay, so now we will move to the commons, which I realize it may not be a familiar idea to many people on this call. So I'm going to start with Astra and ask you, note that you propose in your work an updated commons as one response to insecurity, the problem of insecurity. You make this great distinction between existential insecurity we all have and manufactured insecurity that's created to make us feel more insecure and more fearful. And I'm wondering if you could explain the commons briefly. I know it's really hard for those who may not be so familiar with the concept.
I feel like this is a trick question. No, but
I know.
Okay, 30 seconds. What I want to say actually first is that I was surprised. It surprised me how much the commons came up in this book. A book is always an interesting, I don't know, at least for me, this sort of process of sort of analytic thinking, and you know what you're doing, and then what themes emerge that, I don't know, you didn't necessarily anticipate or see. And the commons became a really core part of the book. So what are the commons? It's a way of describing things that are not necessarily part of the market or the state, the things that we should share. So we could think of the air as the commons, the oceans to a degree, the natural world, culture as a commons, and these can be fraught concepts because then the question is, well, who has more access, and what are the ways that we preserve and protect these resources? Are they resources? Is that even the right way to think about them? I would say maybe I'm not necessarily a fan of the language, but material and cultural things that are not just the domain of the market or the state, but there's there's kind of more grounded history to this idea. So I write, as you said, I distinguish between existential insecurity, which is what I say is human nature. This is the fact that we are vulnerable creatures who are necessarily interdependent. We cannot survive on our own, and we are connected to other people on the planet. That is actually something fundamental and nothing to be ashamed of, but that our economic and political system manufactures insecurity as a form of domination. And so I actually go back to trace this and to make the case that this is indeed a sort of core feature of our economic and political reality. I go back and revisit the emergence of capitalism. And the story often told is that capitalism, the market-based economy, there were often markets, people bought and sold and traded and things, but the idea of a market-based system where markets are at the center was something that emerged over centuries in England, and this process started in the 1200s when feudalism transitioned to capitalism. And so we don't want to romanticize this period. When I say feudalism, it's obviously not a utopia, but the peasantry had traditional rights to the commons, these customary rights to glean, to survive, to fish, to forage, to gather medicines, to gather kindling. These were rights that they over centuries fought for and had to protect. And these, and it was tied to the land, right? To land that was the source of their security, of their well-being. And this land was literally privatized, again, over centuries, over thousands of acts of parliament, and put into the hands of landowners who said they were doing this for the good of the peasants, to make them more industrious and to make things more efficient. And it dispossessed people who then became the proletariat, who were pushed into the cities, and instead of living off the land, exercising their customary rights, sold their labor. And so what I'm saying there is that capitalism, it doesn't just begin with somebody going like, gosh, let's be competitive and efficient. It begins with actually creating conditions of insecurity, of wagelessness, right? So that people have the only security they can reach for is by selling their labor under these conditions that were very new. And so yes, that the story of the commons then is at the center of, I think, our it's a and I mean, I'm not the only one to say this, like the story of the privatization of the commons is central to the development of the modern world. But I think that when we, the angle I'm putting on it is that it actually is that severing of people from the land, that creation, that manufacturing of insecurity is a key component of what sets this in motion. And of course, it didn't only happen to English peasants in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. In different ways, this model was exported around the world. And so, and we're living with that. And the fight, I think, if we want to create a different economic order, has to be a fight for some kind of reinvention of the commons, for some kind of other, again, collaborative form of security. So the commons, we can talk about the commons in terms of all kinds of things, education, again, common sense. What would it be like if the internet was not a commercial cesspool, but a commons? But I think it's good to keep that sort of historical evolution in mind. These are real fights that people had for many generations.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. So Candis, another angle on the commons. Our podcast thinks about the commons as one imperfect model for thinking about an alternative to the market economy. We've been talking about that already today. Indigenous cultures, of course, offer many others. Do you think there can be compatibility between Indigenous approaches and the commons approach?
Short answer is yes.
Never ask yes or no questions is the rule of,
Yeah, and I noticed there's quite a number of Indigenous people in the chat, so it's lovely to see so many people turn out for this. I guess the one thing to remember is that Indigenous is, not really a term that represents the diversity of Indigenous people, Indigenous peoples, right? We want to start adding S's. So if we're going to say commons, we should say peoples too, right? So, I think that diversity is a real strength because there are so many diverse examples of how Indigenous people have set up, preserved through the colonial difficult periods, are still persisting in this moment of ongoing colonialism to enact their sovereignty, to protect their territories, and to relate to other communities, Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities in the face of, so much pressure to develop, to modernize in many of the ways that Astra has just described, right? Those processes are still very much ongoing on many Indigenous lands. So I think there's a lot to be learned from both the diversity of governance systems and societies that have governed Indigenous commons, right? Territories that we hold in common for our collective. And, there's been a lot of scholarship and some journalism that has talked about collectivity And I think activists have often, at moments of major clashes, and we can think here about the Wet'suwet'en land defense, about Mauna Kea, about Standing Rock. You know, I've been teaching a lot of protest-oriented films about land defenses of various kinds to students. It's the class that I'm going to next. And you know, what comes through in many of the articulations from Indigenous leaders at that time is a sense of collectivity that includes not just their own communities, but those around them, those who they are connected to. And I was having a really interesting, deep conversation with a cultural leader from my own nation, from the Tahltan Nation, just a couple of days ago, about how we think about our non-human relatives as societies that we are also interacting with, right? The plants and animals also have their own governance systems, their own way of thinking about the commons, you know, in the context of this conversation, their own way of making sense of the different sensory arrays that they are encountering. And so a lot of Indigenous cultures, you know, diverse as they are, share in common, right, a respect for these other societies that we are also in the midst of relationship with. And I think that, you know, that's come through in a lot of really interesting, you know, new scholarship and writers who are talking about this from Indigenous perspectives. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be learned from it right now.
Yeah, that's really helpful to me in my thinking about all of these things. So thank you for that. I'm going to make a slight shift because I was going to go to Joel for a question about the education commons, but I'm not going to, so we can stay with Candis because Candis has to leave earlier, and I just want to make sure we get to you on the last little piece we wanted to talk to you about. So I'm going to jump, and then I'm going to go back to Joel in a moment, so it'll be a bit out of order. But we have a section here that we wanted to talk about podcasting and kind of public conversation. And as in the first question, when I asked the panelists all to respond, I'm going to do that again. Only right now, I'm just going to ask Candis, but I am going to ask everybody here who's attending the webinar to feel free to answer this question as well, because we'd love to hear your comments from your experience with podcasts or public conversation, as well as any recommendations of podcasts you think this sort of group would like. But moving to Candis, you contribute to Media Indigena, and I'd love to hear a bit about your experience. So what drew you to the podcast format? What does it offer that other media formats don't? What have you learned from being on a podcast that sometimes deals with politicized questions? And what's the experience been like?
I love being part of the Media Indigena podcast. You know, I wish Rick Harp was right here with me. He was actually just visiting campus a couple of weeks ago. And so we were talking about how I got started with it. He has been the creator, host, producer, really like the brain trust that keeps the Media Indigena group kind of going. He sets us up and you know, we collaboratively talk about how we want to do topics, but he's really our fearless leader on the podcast. And he's a longtime Cree journalist from the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation. And, you know, he asked me to be part of it in 2018. I didn't really think I had time to do this, but it has been one of the most kind of life-giving experiences, in part because you know, I'm in conversation with other Indigenous academics and with Rick. And so, you know, the other contributors are Kim Tallbear. She's at the University of Alberta, Brock Pitawanakwat, and Ken Williams. Brock is at York University and Ken is at U of A, and we're all from different Indigenous cultures, different nations, have different perspectives, and yet, you know, we've all been working in the world of scholarship. And so the kinds of things that we talk about, conversations that we get to, I think have been really useful for my thinking, but also, we hear from people, when I go to give an academic talk, inevitably somebody says, oh, I heard that episode, that was great, or I teach with this episode. So I think what I learned from Rick is that most podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. And here Rick has we're over 350 episodes. And so really this archive now and this investment of time and energy, I think it is a really powerful testament to his commitment, but also to the commitment of listeners who come and support the podcast as well. So the richness of those conversations is what has made me make podcasts a assignment in my classes, and students are like, oh no, group project, right? But inevitably at the end of the course they say, oh wow, now I get what Callison was saying, that the work of articulation is hard work, right? And being in conversation with others and coming up against different ways of articulating, even if you agree, is still the work that I think really goes on most podcasts, and the kind of work that we're even doing in this conversation right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, everywhere. I think there is a Media Indigena. There should be a link in the chat will be put in so people can have access to it right after this webinar. So now I'm going to go backwards to Joel Westheimer and our conversation on the commons. And in Joel's case, thinking about public education as a form of the commons. And when we thought of this podcast, we were trying to think of the commons really capaciously. So we were thinking of media, public education as forms of commons that seem potentially really important for this moment. So Joel, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. Well, following Candis, I'll say that my short answer is to whether public education is an example of the commons, is that it should be. My grad students always make fun of me because they say that no matter what course I'm teaching, the course could be called "What are schools for?" Because I think that's the fundamental question. And, when we think about there's such crazy debates over school and arguments and heated stuff. And on the one hand, you can wonder, well, why is that? I mean, schools are, you drop your kids off in the morning, they're occupied for the day, you pick them up at the end. Like, isn't that enough? Like, what is all the contested things in schools? But I think that education and what's taught in schools is kind of a proxy for the society we want to live in. And the society we want to live in, of course, relates to the commons very strongly. So not only is it the obvious public education is a commons in that it brings in all walks of life and we speak to each other, and public education is commonly owned and all of that, but also that it fosters the commons, right? It is a place where we ideally build relationships, where we bring people together across difference. So it's a feeder of the commons. It makes the commons more possible. And this is, of course, all ideally. It's about community building. It also, I think, should strengthen commitments to democratic institutions and to each other. And of course, that's could never be more important than right now, when we have enormously diminishing commitments to democratic institutions and to democracy itself. The problem is, and why I say it should be, and ideally, and I keep using those words, is because the way that we think of education now has been radically transformed. We see education from K-12, including universities, so K-16, as nothing but job training institutions, right? They're individualistic. The idea is to get individual training. Anything that's superfluous to that is deemed unnecessary. And in fact, departments are being cut left and right. This vocabulary is so entrenched, and this way of thinking about it, I guess it goes back to the common sense thing. I mean, I saw this pamphlet crossed my desk recently that was called "Job Training Skills for Kindergartners," And I'm not kidding, as if we could, first of all, prepare kindergarteners for the world of work that they're going to see in 20 years. But also, and more importantly, because it's bypassing the historic roles and purposes of public education, which were, again, in the ideals, to educate a democratic citizenry, right? I mean, it goes back to that Thomas Jefferson quote, which I'll paraphrase badly. If the people are not well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them and give it to a king, but to educate them, right? So education has always been implicated in the work of building a community, building a commons that works. And yet now it's reduced to these completely instrumentalist goals of job training and individualistic instrumental goals. And that leads to other things that people then tend to say. We hear people say in the shrink government and why pay taxes. Adults who don't have children will say, why should I pay for other people's children to go to school? And I think that the lens of the commons gives a very important answer to that, which is that it's not just about fueling individual, ability to get a job or individual gain. It's because you don't want to just, it's not just about individual children being educated. It's because you want to live in an educated society. And I think that really establishes the connection between education and the commons. And I'll just finish by saying that, something that one of my favorite philosophers of education said, Maxine Greene. She was a mentor and a dear friend of mine. She died a few years ago. She was 97 years old. And she said, the purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. And it means, of course, that schools need to be a safe place where relationships are built, where the commons is exemplified, right? Where kids feel free from bullying and free to make mistakes and take chances. But if we stop there, it's not enough. And if we stop at job training, it's not enough, because we also have to trouble the comfortable, meaning we need to make sure that students see that there are problems in the world that need solving, that our commons needs improving, and that we all have a role to play in improving that commons and strengthening it.
Thank you. So we're now at the point where we shift to an open Q&A. I didn't fully get back to that section I anticipated, so I'm really glad I went to you first, Candis, where we were going to talk a bit more about the making of this podcast and ask Astra to think about where public conversation has worked best in her experience. But what I think I'll do is actually turn to the questions from the audience. And if we have time at the end, we can come back to some of those points. And I'm going to start with a question. I'm kind of reading it as I go. So we'll see how it goes. I think it's something for everybody, but I'll see who wants to choose, okay? It's a question from Scott Stoneman. Invoking common sense to argue that the transition to a clean energy commons is impossible is still happening all over the place. This is a really good point. This is everywhere. That's me. I like Imre Ziemann's idea that actively using myth to shape tradition is a useful tactic for overcoming fossilized common sense and galvanizing many diverse people to fight for a stable climate future. What myths or stories of collective struggle and success do you think could be potent ways of convincing folks that climate action is actually an epic opportunity? Does that resonate a response for any of you? Myths or stories?
I'll just say that, common sense in the way that we've all been talking about it is the enemy of imagination, because it's a staid, calcified version of what's possible. And, everything I think all three of us have been talking about is cultivating the imagination, imagining a world that could be different. and imagining possibilities of not using fossil fuels, of imagining a different way of being than rampant cannibalistic capitalism. But we need imagination for that, and for that you need to open up the notion of common sense.
Yeah, I have to run in just a couple of minutes here, but I love this idea of myths and stories being powerful, metaphor, concepts, motivators to think differently and to approach particularly our need for fuel to keep society going the way it is. I think that to me that part of the problem has been what's captured my personal imagination, is how do we begin to think differently about how we live with each other and live with the societies and communities of plants and animals that we are also a part of, and how do we live with the more than humans, the lands and waters. So I think, I don't have no story is coming to mind from my own culture, but I think that there are so many rich stories from indigenous cultures that provide like a different way of thinking about our relations. And my daughter is doing some fishing right now in the north, and she asked me what we do with fish after we've caught them. And I said, well, one of the most important things I was taught by elders in my nation was to make sure that we hang our fish when we hang them to dry before we cut them, so that they are facing upstream, so that all the fish who are still in the river know which way to go, right? They can see that they need to get to the spawning grounds and what direction that is, right? And so like everything we do, helps us move in the right direction. And so I think for me, that's like a key aspect of thinking about what kinds of signs and stories that we need to pay attention to. And I have to go to my class, so it's been
Thank you
lovely to be
very
in conversation with you all.
Thank you. And you'll get the recording after. So another person asks if podcasting itself is a form of the commons. And that actually lets me segue back to the questions we couldn't ask about. Joel, if you want to talk a little bit about how you see the podcast we did, and Astra, if you want to reflect a little bit on what forms of public conversation have seemed most valuable to you, and the role of public conversation in your organizing and the work you do. So I'll go Joel first.
So first of all, podcasting is fun, but it also breaks the soundbite culture that we're in. You can't nuance doesn't fit in a tweet or an Instagram post, and podcast gives you the opportunity to explore things in depth. Even when I do segments on education with CBC, those segments are 6 or 7 minutes, and you can't go in depth in the way you can in a podcast. And then podcasting itself, of course, is a commons, because we're co-constructing things. We're having discussions. Candis brought up the Washington Post example that we saw this morning, where Bezos decided that the opinions page could only say things like the freedom and the free market. And so podcasting, I think, is a potentially more democratic platform than the kind of oligarchy controlled media that we're seeing right now. The tagline of "Democracy dies in darkness," which is the Washington Post tagline, has seemed to move more from warning to something aspirational. And so I see podcasts as sort of an antidote to that. They have the power to change the narrative.
Nice.
Sorry, that definitely resonates. They're definitely aspiring to that today. But I think the flip side of that, though, is that also many podcasts are very right wing, in many of the most popular podcasts right now, which is why there was all this talk after the American election about a Joe Rogan of the left. I think if I put on my optimist hat, what I think, tuning into those, because I occasionally do, is that people are hungry to understand the world and to help with sense making.
Yeah.
And the theories that are being broadcast at scale, are not illuminating facts, but are actually helping to manufacture the insecurity that I name in the book, right? So yes, indeed, you are a victim. There are these shadowy forces. And so podcasts can be, forms of confusion, or they can be forms of enlightenment, just like schools can be sort of engines of inequality or engines of egalitarianism and democracy. And which is, I guess under that is the fact that what's really important is power. And so when, so yeah, when you're asking what public conversations work, I'm someone who kind of always straddles between my sort of writing and communications hat and then my organizing and power building hat. And so, I wanted to switch the question and say less, when does public conversation work? At the Debt Collective, which is the union for debtors I helped found, we talk a lot about popular education, political education, right? So understanding that many people are not in schools in their adult life, and that they also need forms of learning and conversation and engagement that helps them better understand the world, but also understand how to build that collective power and solidarity so that they can change the things that we're talking about. And that work is just so critical, because if people have an analysis that's telling them, oh yeah, the source of your pain is actually immigrants, right? Not the bosses who are squeezing your wages, or it's evil leftists who want to cut off energy sources in order to and that climate change isn't real, and it's actually some a conspiracy, then people are going to have they're going to take the wrong actions as a result of that. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think what I'd like to see more of, and it works great in many circumstances, is conversation, tied to building the kind of infrastructure that can hold people to take collective action. And if you go back and read about the history of the left, there's actually so many cases, so many instances of working class people building those kinds of forums. I'm forgetting the name right now. You might know it, Joel, but for example, the cigar rollers would pay someone to be a kind of lecturer who would read, everything from poetry to political theory to the workers as they worked with their hands, right? If you go back and you read about populist movements, they often had lecturers who would go from town to town, sort of educating people, also rousing them to action. So that kind of education, I think, is the kind that I'm most excited about.
Yeah, that's great. I love the line too of building infrastructure that lets ordinary people make change. Like, that just seems really important. We have a bunch of questions from the larger audience that are rolling in. Let me see. Hold on, sorry, they jump around a little bit on my page. Canada has a carbon pricing policy where people who pollute with fossil fuels pay into a common pool, and then it is redistributed equally, and most come out ahead. It is rooted in the thought, who owns the air? Any comment on how the common sense narrative is in alignment with this policy or not? I don't know if either of you feel like it's a question you can respond to.
Might be for you.
Yeah. Maybe you can respond, Barbara.
I don't feel like I know enough about our policies on fossil fuel. I don't know enough about the policy, actually, to really understand. Like, the problem is who owns the air. But I don't, it's not my arena well enough. Can you see it?
Yeah, I don't know. And also, who's the recipient of these equal redistributions? I'm not sure I have enough
It's
context.
not clear enough to me. I'm sure it's a great question. If I just don't know the context to be able to say anything. Well, I have another one. In many of these conversations about communications, I often feel a hole around the idea of audience and strategies to spread commons, justice, equality-based ideas to people who are not already listening. Any thoughts on this? Is it even worth it? Or are there enough inactive people who are left leaning enough to be a worthwhile target? So it sounds like this is a question about like who's listening and are there enough people? I have lots of thoughts on those questions, but I'm going to put it over to you guys.
Well, I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, I think that question really resonated with me. It's a question I ask myself a lot as I feel like I'm shouting into the void or organizing and trying to get more people to participate. I think that we, I think that speaking should be an act of invitation, and to go to kind of teaching styles, right? I mean, we don't want to just to be lecturing at people or using that sort of banking model of education where like, I have the truth, I will inject my, I will inject my ideology into you. It has to be something where there's space for people and where they are engaged and interested. And that means, that we have to think about our messages. Are they condescending? Are they entertaining? Are we talking in a way that makes people feel that even if they don't understand or know about something, that actually they feel kind of safe to learn, right? And be in that position of curiosity. So, and one thing the right-wing podcast that I mentioned do is most of the time they're talking about things people really enjoy, like sports or, movies, right? And the politics is actually just sort of infused around topics that people are thinking about in a different register. So maybe we could also learn from that. I think these are the questions. I think these are questions I will probably wrestle with in all of my change making and media making career, because you never know. It's always an act of faith to put a message out there. And I think there are certain techniques to improve our odds of reaching people, but there's never a guarantee.
Yeah, your comments make me think of one of the youth activists, climate activists we interviewed, who always said that her goal was going to where the energy is, Olivia Cunnins-Berkowitz. And so the idea is like create the energy that people want to come to. There are a lot of us, but if you're not giving people something that's drawing them there, then you want to think about what you should be doing, how it's being done elsewhere in effective ways. But that's something that stayed with me.
I'll just say one thing on that briefly. I mean, the question is in large part about echo chambers, right? And I think it is a problem that there's probably different groups of people that listen to different podcasts, except the ones Astra was talking about, maybe sports, sometimes psychology and things like that. And so it's true that, which I don't think makes them useless. Like we all need this, especially in these times. We also, we don't only need to talk across differences. We also need to be reassured that there are other people out there who think like us. But I will just say that, education is my thing. But I think that in an echo chamber society, schools are one place where people come together and there's work that can be done and there's research that shows that you can build the kind of relationships that allow people to listen to different perspectives. Because we know, also from research that when confronted with incontrovertible evidence that contradicts someone's position, they don't change their mind, they double down. And that's, I think, because they can't risk breaking allegiance with their communities, with their church, with their families, with their friends, with everyone. And so there's a task here of building relationships across those different perspectives to create other communities. And I think that schools are one way you can do that. I don't know if podcasts can.
We'll see. Okay, well, thank you so much to both of you. I'm just going to close with a couple comments and pointers for everybody, but I want to close this part of it by citing something you said, Astra, in our interview, which is there are little experiments happening everywhere. And something Candis said, which is how we imagine the future determines what kinds of decisions we make in the present. And in the spirit of those comments, I'm thinking that what we're hoping that this webinar and podcast can do is be an experiment that can help us imagine a better, more livable future for all, like trying to bring more people in around an idea that privileges collectivity, sharing, and thinking differently and in multiple ways. I mean, there's so many examples of this sort of work happening, and I'm always seeking them out, and I'll look forward to seeing what's in the chat at the end. But now I would like to thank everybody here for joining us. We really appreciate a lively chat, and we really appreciate your participation. Huge thanks to our panelists, Joel, Astra, and Candis in her absence. I want to mention that there's a survey that you're going to get when you sign off. And if you take a few minutes to fill it out, it really helps us a lot to improve the webinars and also know what you're looking for and what's helpful to you. And that our website should be posted in the chat somewhere, and it will have curriculum and resources posted on it with each episode as each episode's released. But you should just sign up now so that you'll get, if you're interested, so you'll get the upcoming episodes as they unfold. And last but not least, you should consider getting involved with Re.Climate. You can go to the website, and you can also follow us on LinkedIn. Any concluding comments you'd like to make, Joel or Astra? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.